U.S. and Australian officials say they've tightened their bonds on a number of issues, like recovering from the pandemic and countering the CCP's coercive actions. NTD Miguel Moreno has more on the international talk.
Discussions on foreign policy between Australia and the U.S., and for the most part, addressing issues particularly related to the Chinese Communist Party.
We look forward to working together on our nation's ongoing economic recovery from this entirely preventable pandemic. Today, we reaffirmed our collective commitment to strengthening supply chains so that they're resilient against future pandemics, CCP retaliation, and the use of forced labor.
The Secretary of State commended Australia for its response against the CCP's sweeping national security law, rejecting Huawei and publicly condemning China's propaganda campaign. And to monitor disinformation, Australia's foreign minister unveiled a new system between them and the U.S.
We're therefore pleased also to be able to announce a new working group between Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the United States Department of State to monitor and respond to harmful disinformation.
Defense Secretary Mark Esper went over a recent display of naval cooperation between 5 Australian warships, an American carrier strike group, and a Japanese destroyer in the Philippine Sea.
These exercises not only bolster interoperability, but also send a clear signal to Beijing that we will fly, we will sell, and we will operate wherever international law allows, and defend the rights of our allies and partners to do the same.
Australian Defense Minister Linda Reynolds says they intend to establish a U.S. military fuel reserve in Darwin. She also says the two nations agreed to deepen their cooperation in defense science technology. Miguel Moreno, NTD News.
And a former chair of a Harvard department has been charged by U.S. prosecutors for covering up and lying about his China ties. He's the highest profile person so far to emerge from a crackdown on Chinese influence in U.S. universities.
U.S. prosecutors brought tax charges against a Harvard University professor. Charles Lieber, the former chair of Harvard's Chemistry and Chemical Biology Department, is accused of lying to authorities about his ties to a China-run recruitment program and funding he allegedly received from the Chinese Communist Party. The Justice Department is currently cracking down on Chinese influence within universities. The move comes as concerns about spying and intellectual property theft by the CCP are rising. Lieber's case is one of the highest profile cases to emerge from the crackdown so far. His case centers on China's Thousand Talents program. According to U.S. authorities, China uses the program to entice overseas Chinese citizens and foreign researchers to share their knowledge with China. Prosecutors say Lieber became a strategic scientist at a Wuhan university in 2011 and later contractually participated in the Thousand Talents program. They further allege that under his contract, Lieber was paid up to $50,000 a month and living expenses of up to almost $160,000. He also was awarded more than $1.5 million to establish a research lab. In exchange, Lieber agreed to organize international conferences, publish articles, and apply for patents in the university's name.
Alarm bells were raised when a fleet of Chinese fishing boats came close to the Galapagos Islands. The authorities wish to seek international consensus on a strategy to protect the marine fauna of the region.
The Ecuadorian Navy last week identified some 260 boats which came close to the Galapagos Islands. They raised the alert to the authorities. Most of these vessels were Chinese flagged. In 2017, a Chinese vessel was captured in the Galapagos Marine Reserve with 300 tons of species. Ecuador said that it will take diplomatic steps to protect the Galapagos Islands. The country's officials will raise the issue at a meeting with delegates from Latin American countries. They wish to devise a common strategy to protect the marine fauna of the region.
As long as the diplomatic negotiation route is open, that will be the only route used in the hope, and with almost total certainty, that the problems caused by the presence of this international fishing fleet will be resolved through this channel.
The country is seeking international consensus on preventing activity near the Galapagos. With interference from ships, the delicate ecosystem of the area could be seriously affected. The archipelago has a wide variety of turtles, flamingos, and seabirds. There is also a great wealth of marine flora and fauna. The fishing fleet that was spotted had not yet entered the exclusive economic zone of the islands.
A prominent Hong Kong activist was fired from his tenured position at a university on Tuesday. He was a central figure in Hong Kong's umbrella movement protests in 2014, which paralyzed the city for almost 80 days. NTD's Juliet Song has more.
The University of Hong Kong fired a leading pro-democracy activist from his tenured position. Benny Tai, an associate law professor, has been teaching there for almost 3 decades. He was also a prominent figure in Hong Kong's umbrella protests in 2014. The movement paralyzed the city for almost 80 days as demonstrators occupied main roads, demanding real elections for the city. Tai was charged with being a so-called public nuisance last year. He was sentenced to 16 months in prison, but was released on bail. The university later started reviewing his position. Tai wrote on Facebook that the university's move marks the end of academic freedom in Hong Kong. He added that he's heartbroken to witness the demise of his beloved university, but won't stop his fight for Hong Kong's rule of law. Outside of academia, pressure is also intensifying in Hong Kong's political circle. Prominent activist Joshua Wong said he doesn't plan to continue asking the U.S. or other countries for sanctions on Hong Kong. In 2019, Wong was one of the activists urging U.S. politicians to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. The change came in less than a month after Beijing imposed the national security law. Over the weekend, election officials sent letters pressing Wong and other Democratic candidates for their political stance on a number of issues, including the national security law and their lobbying efforts in the U.S. They were given less than 24 hours to respond. The national security law punishes acts like colluding with foreign forces with sentences of up to life in prison. Concerns are rising that Hong Kong's government will use the new law to disqualify opposition candidates during the city's elections. This ahead of the next legislative election, which is scheduled for September. Next, on to finances. A top Hong Kong politician says a U.S. bank closed one of his accounts. The revelation drew public attention as the U.S. recently announced sanctions on Hong Kong officials that helped implement the new national security law. Banks that do business with them risk being cut off from the U.S. financial system. The politician Bernard Chan is an advisor to Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam. He says his account closure has nothing to do with the law, as it happened before it was announced. He added that other senior officials are facing similar problems. In an interview with the Financial Times, he said, quote, "I am so sure it's not just me. I even talked to government civil servants. Banks don't want some of them too," unquote. Chan said banks have long been careful in dealing with prominent public figures, but that the U.S. sanctions would make them even more cautious in their interactions with Hong Kong officials. Banks in Hong Kong are now in a tough situation, as they have to both comply with the national security law and avoid U.S. sanctions. They've been urging authorities to clarify whether closing sanctioned officials' accounts would violate the law. Reporting by Juliet Song, NTD News.
And the world's largest pilots union said they want FedEx to halt its Hong Kong operation. Several pilots have been held in miserable conditions when they had to go into mandated quarantine. The union representing FedEx pilots called on the package delivery company to suspend its operations in Hong Kong. The call comes after some of its members were subject to what they called extremely difficult conditions in government-mandated quarantine. Several pilots who tested negative but had been in contact with individuals who tested positive were put into government camps under what they said were extremely difficult conditions.